Sean, why don't you give us a sense of things of like how other countries, particularly in Europe, might be viewing the policy landscape in the US? And I mean, Will mentioned retaliation. I'm curious whether you think that's actually on the table or if people are just going to find other ways. I saw recently, a leader in Europe say, well, maybe we'll buy more LNG from the U.S. and not have to deal with the tariffs. I'm curious your thoughts on the policy landscape.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think there's probably good reason to take a step back because as we've seen since the first Trump administration until today, a lot of these debates in the international tax space could be characterized in different ways. So my first main question, I think we could start by just posing some questions that policymakers should be considering. The first is really, what are the priorities or objectives of tax and trade policy in the United States, in the EU, and then, of course, with the work at the OECD and the UN on the international tax front? Are they to set standards, which has been, I think, that was a theme in the Obama administration? Rather, should we fix the WTO? Should we have a free trade agreement between the EU and the US, TTIP? With the goal of setting international standards as kind of a confronting China and their rise in the international system. Are the priorities and objectives of tax and trade to raise revenue? I think from a tax foundation perspective, we would hope that tax policy is viewed through the lens of raising revenue efficiently and looking at that angle of things. But of course, there are other objectives that one might prioritize. Another priority or objective of tax and trade going forward might just be decoupling and de-risking. And so I think the first main question is, what are policymakers in Europe and the United States thinking about the objectives? What are they trying to achieve with some of these policies? The second question then, of course, leads to, well, to what extent will the US and the EU work together or not work together on achieving those objectives? So can we align ourselves transatlantically on the objectives? And if we can, how would we go forward? And if we can't, how do we go forward? And I think that's the second big question. A kind of side note on the EU side is who actually decides politically in these regards. It's not always clear between the Commission and member states. Even within the Commission, we've been seeing with some of their hearings, it's not quite clear exactly who in the Commission would be making these decisions about whether to cooperate or to fight against some of the U.S. In terms of retaliation. So that's my second kind of big question. And the third one, I think policymakers specifically in Europe should be thinking about is, what is the EU's approach to competition generally? So that's been a big topic with the Letter report and the Draghi report of recent. There's kind of two camps. One is, well, should we double down on industrial policy and subsidies and go that route, government intervention? Or should we be taking more of an efficient approach, looking at our tax rates, our tax base? How can we be more neutral and competitive through our tax code in that sense? So this kind of question is a broad question, I think, for all European policymakers at member state level and at the EU level. But of course, for this webinar, the question is, well, what impact does the U.S. election and potentially, our tax reform, our trade policy, given that, what should Europe do? I think some highlights to point out are, one, if Trump is serious about reducing our corporate tax rate to 15%, that would make investment decisions towards the United States from Europe that much more attractive. And that could be worrisome for EU policymakers. Another thing is the IRA and the CHIPS Act. Those are sort of our industrial policy here in the U.S. And it's not clear to me that Congress will necessarily be on board with gutting a lot of those subsidies or some of those attractive money handouts to companies who may want to come over from Europe to invest here. So there's a real possibility that the United States essentially has a very competitive corporate tax rate and on top of it, some kind of industrial policy that's targeting specific sectors to bring business over to the United States. So that's truly the case. It really does come down to European policymakers and their questions of how do they become more competitive? How do they respond in that type of a scenario? And what policies should they be looking at?